week 7 of Cultivate. It's our final teaching week, and we really hope that God's been stirring things up in you, inviting you to explore new ways of thinking about church and mission, and more importantly, new ways of doing church and mission. So far, we've asked 5 questions. Why are we here? Why do we plant? How do we start? What do we plant? And how do we plant? And this week, we're asking our 6th question, how do we keep going? But as usual, before we get into that, for the final time, it's the 1-minute recap. For our last few weeks, we've been reminding ourselves that in Cultivate, we've been talking about journeys, missional journeys, that God instigates to reach the 99% of people who don't know anything about him. And we're called to join in these journeys, and some of us are called to lead them. The starting gun for each of these journeys is call and vision, and God usually calls you to the places that you already inhabit and to the people that you already encounter. These journeys aren't solitary. They're nearly always better done in community. And these communities, worship communities, need planting. These worship communities have a number of important characteristics in common. And last week we spoke about the planting cycle. We said that planting requires purpose, which is a missional vision. It requires people, other people to do it with. Prayer, which is the power to proceed. It requires plans to make and grow disciples, and the 5 key priorities to focus on: mission, discipleship, community, worship, and leadership. Okay, that's our 1-minute recap. Let's get started on week 7 as we try and answer our final question: how do we keep going?
And there's only really one place we can start when we examine those things that help us keep going, that will enable our journeys of missional discipleship and planting, and that is to be empowered by prayer. In his book, Red Moon Rising, Pete Greig tells a couple of stories. The first is about a German who lived in the 1720s called Count Zinzendorf, who allowed Christians fleeing persecution to live on his land. And in August 1727, these Christians had a powerful encounter with the Holy Spirit and they began praying. And 2 weeks later, they organized a 24-hour prayer meeting which continued 24/7 for 100 years. For 100 years. 5 years after beginning this colossal prayer meeting, they started sending out missionaries. They had generated 3,000 missionaries in the first 200 years of their existence. They influenced the world. Actually, many were impacted, including a guy called John Wesley, and we know what happened to him. Second story occurred in the last century in Kenya, and it was about a guy called Mike Brown, who was orphaned at the age of 8. And he became a street kid. And when he was 14, he was eventually poisoned by some food he had scavenged. But he was healed miraculously and he became a Christian. At the age 22, he and 12 mates planted a church. And do you know how they started? They gathered in a room and they prayed non-stop for 40 days. Mike Brown said, they just assumed that was how you should plant a church. After 40 days, they went out and started preaching. First day, nothing happened. But these guys weren't discouraged. They said, we knew we had broken through after all that prayer. We just had to keep going until it happened. Second day, a homeless guy kept heckling them until he gave his life to Jesus. And then they went mad. Several hundred people became Christians in a short period of time. Count Zinzendorf and the Moravians, Mike Brown and his mates, they believed in prayer. Nearly all of us hearing this would probably say that we believe in prayer. But I would suggest to you, as I do to myself, as I look at myself in the mirror, that how we lead and how we act would suggest that we don't believe in prayer like they did. In fact, if we are honest, our diaries would sometimes suggest that some of us don't believe in prayer at all. A recent survey suggested only 30% of Christians in the UK pray every day, and only 18% of them have a regular pattern of prayer. And if you think clergy and church leaders are exempt from this, you'd be wrong, actually. A recent survey I read said that church leaders, ministers on average, prayed for 3 minutes a day. If you are going to keep going, to keep persisting in the missional journey that God has called you on, it is vital that you develop a pattern and rhythm of prayer in yourself and in your team. You cannot rely on feeling like praying to keep on praying. I don't have to tell you that prayer isn't easy. Sometimes we are caught up in praise and worship and prayer seems effortless, but sometimes we just have to fall back on a plan. I was recently reading again recently about Mother Teresa, a woman whose holiness and faithfulness and service graced the previous generation. In fact, her humility and grace made her one of the most famous people on earth. But she confessed in a journal once that she rarely felt the presence of God in her prayers. And yet she persisted in what she called her private fidelities, her private habits of prayer, basically her prayer plan. And she said in her diary, though I do not feel his presence, I will still love him like he has never been loved before. Prayer is not easy. It's not straightforward. It is challenging. But if you want to keep going in your journey, you must have a plan, a habit, a pattern for your prayer. I always say, you always make patterns for your priorities. If prayer is a priority for you, make a pattern, get a plan. And, originally I was going to mention other things, but as I was praying for this particular session, I felt strongly prompted to drop some other stuff and basically tell a story. And so I'm going to. Every summer, I set aside a week of prayer, and the sole purpose of that week is to hear God for my year ahead in ministry. And I'll speak on that in greater detail in our sessions on leadership following this course. And every year, God speaks in a precise and remarkable way about my theme and overarching direction of that a year ahead. And every year I come with a blank piece of paper with fear and trepidation and lack of faith, actually, that I won't hear anything. I really do. And every single year, God surprises me. And one year, just before I went on this week, one of my leaders in Gateway, our church plant in Wigan, a wonderful lady called Cags, she sent me an email saying that during a time of prayer, she felt she had a message from God for Gateway. And Cags is someone I'd grown to know and trust prophetically. At times, she has been mind-blowingly accurate. And so I read it eagerly. And it was from Psalm 127, verse 1. Unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. And I read it and I thought, okay, sounds okay. Nothing offensive here, but not particularly sexy either. I'll put it on my pending file and we'll see what happens. So I set off on my prayer week, and I've learned to take very seriously my prayer readings for that week, readings that I don't choose myself, but I find myself reading on that week. And this week, like a good Anglican priest, I read the lectionary. Sometimes I use other scripture reading schedules, but this week I felt it was right to use the lectionary. And on that second morning, Tuesday morning it was, I opened my preset Bible reading, and it was from Psalm 127, verse 1. Unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. I went away on holiday in August, and when I came back, I opened my emails, as you do. And on that first day back, first day of this new season, I opened an email from somebody I don't know, who didn't know Gateway at all. I still don't know why they sent me this email, but it was a word of prophecy from them. And right across the top of this email, in big, bold letters, were the words, Psalm 127, verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. Early January, a few months later, I was sitting in our leaders' prayer meeting, a sort of meeting of church leaders from across Wigan who met every week for prayer. And as I sat there quietly praying, I suddenly found myself praying, Lord, give us a word. What is your message for us in this group this year? And barely had I prayed this, then Psalm 127 banged into my brain. I hadn't thought about it genuinely for weeks. But it was so strong and immediate that I shared it with my fellow leaders. I said, my friends, I think God is saying something from Psalm 127, verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house. I shared this, and then literally 10 seconds later, something buzzed in my pocket. An email had come through, and usually I ignore it. As most of my friends and colleagues and my wife particularly know, I nearly always ignore my phone. But for some reason, without thinking, I reached into my pocket and clicked on the email. And it was a newsletter from a friend of mine, a church planter in Manchester. I only hear from him every kind of 6 months or so. And as I opened it, the first thing that caught my eye were the words written across the top of this email in big, bold letters, Psalm 127, verse 1, unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. Not one hammer blow, not two, not three, not even four, but 5 times. And the reason I mention it now is because I believe this was not just a word for us in Gateway that year, even though it was. It wasn't just for those church leaders that year, even though it was. This is the clarion call of God over all his disciples and all those called to be involved in starting or joining new worship communities. Unless God builds it, it ain't going to work. We labor in vain. Unless we are empowered by prayer, it isn't going to work. Unless prayer underpins our vision, our planning, our community, our mission, our discipleship, unless it underpins it all, it isn't going to work, my friends. Unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. Unless the workers pray, we stop being partners with he who is building the house. I'll finish with this. A few years ago, when one of the Korean prayer missions came to Wigan, it was led by a guy called Pastor Min. And one evening he told us how his church began. He said it began with 15 people meeting in a basement with no gifts, no money, no church building, no people, no strength, no ideas, nothing. But this group of 15 people prayed. They prayed relentlessly. They prayed up and down prayer mountains. They prayed overnight. They prayed with passion and energy and time. They would not take weakness and silence and discouragement as a final word. They kept on. And in 2 decades, those 15 people have become 10,000 people, and people are becoming Christians every week. But even now, with 10,000 people, Pastor Min says their power still comes from prayer. Our worship communities must be empowered by prayer. Prayer is the first response to crisis. It's the primary weapon of our spiritual battle. It's the power behind evangelism. It's a source of inspiration. It's the engine of growth. It's a bedrock of discipleship. It's the glue of community. You don't need to pray in a certain way. In fact, learn to pray in many, many ways. Prayer doesn't need talent or gifts or money or resource. You just need the will. Unless the Lord builds the house, the workers labor in vain. Unless the workers pray, we stop being partners with he who is building the house. If we are going to keep going, to keep persisting, to keep going on this journey of missional discipleship and planting that God has called us on for the glory of his name and for the sake of the 99%, we will need to be empowered by prayer. Okay, as before, let's discuss a couple of questions in our groups. See you in a few minutes.
Richard Branson has a plan, and this plan is to get as many of us as possible into space. The company that will do it, apparently, is called Virgin Galactic. Richard Branson has big plans, and Richard Branson has a lot of money. His net worth is over £4.5 billion, apparently. But it wasn't always like that for Richard Branson. Back in the 1960s, he started out trying to sell Christmas trees and budgies. That's how he started, and he failed at both of these. He finally launched his first successful business, a little magazine called Student. Richard Branson didn't start out with big money and a big company. He started small. All great things usually begin small. And one of the enduring characteristics of the new worship communities that we've been talking about these last 7 sessions is that they're nearly always small communities. Some of them might end up growing comparatively large, but most of them won't. The plan to engage with many non-Christians beyond our current communities of faith doesn't rely on a few big worship communities, but many, many small ones. And if you're going to persist in this journey of starting or joining new worship communities, of being involved in these missional journeys, you may well hit a point where you think, this thing we're doing is so small. What's the point? Will anyone notice if we just pack it in? In order to keep on going, we need to believe in small. And I wish we had more time for this, but I want to just give you 3 reasons why small is beautiful when it comes to planting. The first is this. Starting small is a fundamental principle of God's kingdom. Innocuous beginnings leading to large growth are a sign of God's kingdom. Starting small is a fundamental aspect of that. When we gave that comparison a couple of sessions ago between bringing people to a worship service every day, which took 10,000 years to re-evangelize the world, or each of us bringing one person a year to Jesus, which took 32 years to re-evangelize the world, I wonder if you noticed something. Bringing one a year to Jesus ends up with greater numbers ultimately, much greater, but it takes more time to get going. In that illustration, 1,000 converts through a daily worship service produced 365,000 new people in that first year. Bringing one a year to Jesus produced 100 new people in that first year. In fact, it's not until the 16th year before that method catches up, and then it completely takes off. A lot of people might have given up before 16 years has passed. But our Bibles are crammed full of this principle. Starting small is a fundamental principle of God's kingdom. Zechariah 4:10 says, "Do not despise these small beginnings." Mark 4:31 says, "A tiny mustard seed is smallest of all seeds, but it grows into the largest of garden plants." Galatians 5:9 says, "A pinch of yeast works through a whole batch of dough." Your plan, your vision might seem very, very small in your eyes. How can this change anything, you might say? How can this small thing be important in God's kingdom? How can it be part of the plan? Don't despise it, and don't let anyone else despise it. And you remember way back in session 1 when we spoke about the importance of the piccolo? The great conductor noticed when the piccolo was missing, and we said that God, the great conductor, notices when each of us, in our small way, is missing from his great symphony, his great work of mission. Well, it's true of individuals and it's true of worship communities. Your small worship community might feel like a little piccolo, just one instrument in a vast orchestra, but it's vital as part of the whole. Your worship community may well be, in fact probably is, engaging with a group of people that no one else is. However small it is, it's vital to that group of people, it's vital to God, and it is vital to his church. The first reason that small is beautiful is that small is a fundamental principle of God's kingdom. The second reason is that the big is a dangerous fascination for church leaders. Way back in session 2, when we were making the case for planting new worship communities, we spoke about the disruptors who encourage us to go small and spread wide, how much more powerful it is to go small and spread wide. If you remember, we used the Airbnb example to illustrate this. And we could spend much more time on this, but as human beings, I believe we have a dangerous attachment to the big. And often as Christian leaders, whatever we're leading, we have a dangerous fascination. Even though we might not say it out loud, the big validates our sense of worth. It makes us feel successful. It's what we often subscribe to. We seek growth above all things. We're drawn to mega churches and mega church leaders. We weigh our growth in numbers against other leaders and other worship communities, whether we admit to it or not. But it's a dangerous attachment and a false one. In America, the land of the mega church, half of churches have less than 75 people. In China, the land of missional explosion, all house churches have a maximum of 15 people in them, by law and actually by design. The places and seasons of profound missional growth often happened when communities stayed small and reproduced. The Mennonite Church in Ethiopia in 1982 had about 5,000 people in it when the communists took over. Buildings were confiscated, leaders seized, worship services stopped. Church as we knew it was over. This lasted 10 years. When the communist regime ended in 1992, the Christians came out of hiding, and to everyone's shock, they were now 50,000 in number. It happened famously in China when the Cultural Revolution sought to eliminate religion completely. Buildings confiscated, leaders seized, worship services stopped. Church as we knew it was over. But underground, it grew from about 2 million Christians in 1949 to over 60 million some decades later. Some people estimate there may be over 160 million Christians in China, something like 12% of their entire population. And in both those situations, what had happened was that large churches had splintered into small worship communities, simply because these worship communities were less visible to a government that threatened them. And these worship communities were not able to engage in the public activity in religion and faith, but they were able to focus on those 5 priorities we mentioned 2 weeks ago: growing in community, deepening their discipleship, developing simple acts of worship, and fundamentally focusing on mission. They were not led by clergy because the clergy had been imprisoned or had fled, but by lay people like you. Instead of a few big churches, they had become many, many small worship communities, and they grew. They grew like mad. And these viral movements of God's kingdom are spirit-filled movements. They're not led and directed by superstar leaders, but by the Spirit of God. They were small, prayer-dominated, spirit-filled, missionally active communities of disciples of Jesus. When we look back over history and see the times of astonishing growth in the church, it occurs when we don't think big and few, but small and many. Seemingly, this is a crucial characteristic of God's kingdom, a crucial characteristic of viral, spirit-filled movements. Begin small, stay small, but spread wide. Stay small, but reproduce. So small is beautiful because small is a principle of God's kingdom, because the big is sometimes a dangerous and false fascination for the church. And finally, because if community is your centre of gravity, you must stay small. If we believe that community is a fundamental principle of a worship community, as we argued for 2 weeks ago, then the only way we maintain community is by staying small. There's a famous number that some of you will have heard about called the Dunbar number, which is called after the British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who found that there was a correlation in mammals between brain size and average social group size. And after doing lots of research on this, he suggested that the maximum number of people you could have a stable relationship with is 150. And by stable relationship, he said, and I quote, "the number of people you would not feel embarrassed about joining uninvited for a drink if you happen to bump into them in a bar." And because his arguments and evidence for this is so compelling, many companies and organisations use Dunbar's number in working out how they organise themselves. For instance, by trial and error, the leadership of the company that makes Gore-Tex discovered that if more than 150 employees were working together in one building, different social problems could occur. So they started building company buildings with a limit of 150 employees and only 150 parking spaces. When the parking spaces were filled, the company would build another 150 employee building. They discovered that if they were going to maintain effective relationships in their organisation, they couldn't grow too big. But not feeling embarrassed about joining uninvited for a drink if you happen to bump into them in a bar doesn't sound like a brilliant definition of community to me. In fact, Dunbar had another less famous number, and that was 15. 15 people. In his research, he recognised that there are 5 people to whom we devote about 40% of our available social time, and 10 more people to whom we devote another 20%. All in all, he discovered that we devote about 2/3 of our time to just 15 people. Robin Dunbar discovered that we are built for small. We just work that way. If community is a vital principle of God's church, we must, as the Airbnb model tells us, stay small and spread wide. We must stay small but reproduce. We don't aim for big, we aim for many. Small is beautiful when it comes to new worship communities, because small is a vital principle of God's kingdom, because the big is a dangerous fascination for church leaders, and because if community is our centre of gravity, we must stay small. Okay, as before, let's discuss a couple of questions in our groups. See you in a few minutes.
Way back at the beginning of our first session in Cultivate, we started by saying that there were 4 essential qualities for all missional disciples, for planters of new worship communities. And those first 2, if you remember, were devotion and dependence. Today, we're going to end with the final 2 essential qualities of a missional disciple or planter. But first, a story. There was once a man who was born into a desperately poor family. He had poor education. He was an apprentice shoemaker, but he didn't make it. He tried his hand at running a school, but that school functioned badly. His marriage was sadly an unhappy one, during which his daughter died early. He was a deeply committed believer, but his attempt at pastoring a small church stopped any chances of ordination, because by common consent his sermons were tedious and boring. Despite such a bad track record, this guy formed a missionary organisation, initially involving just one person, himself. When he got to India, he translated portions of the Bible into 29 languages. Then one day, there was a fire at his home, and he lost 10 years translation work in that fire. All of it gone, no backups. And amongst the wreckage of his dreams, his goals, his long-held vision, the sweat and blood and the tears and the effort, amongst it all, he heard God say, "Start again." And so he did. Start again. And this man's obedience and perseverance has impacted the lives of millions of people. And in time, he came to be called the father of modern missions. His name was William Carey. You may well have heard of him. Carey demonstrates a fundamental principle of Christian discipleship and leadership. And I want to end this evening with just that. We've talked about some practical things regarding planting. But you know what? That practical stuff is really important, but you won't sink or swim on it. You won't sink or swim on practical failures or triumphs. Your plant won't die if your process is a little unconventional. But there's a reason why plants and startups do die, lots of them. That's down to a lack of two other qualities of Christian discipleship and leadership. Two essential qualities. We started with devotion and dependence. We end with courage and perseverance. I found it really interesting that usually when God calls his people to do a great task, when he confronts them with a journey and a calling, he first urges them to have courage, to take up courage. Joshua, on the verge of entering the promised land, 7 times he was urged to have courage. Solomon, this young king, on the verge of a remarkable transformation of a kingdom and the building of a great temple. Hezekiah, faced with the greatest threat to Israel's existence. Ezra, given the task of rebuilding the temple of God. Peter and John, in the face of Jewish persecution. Mary, faced with an out-of-wedlock pregnancy that could and should have got her killed. All of them were confronted by God, and God said to each of them, "Be courageous. Take courage." He didn't ask them to have faith or patience or skill or wisdom, even though they needed those things. He asked them first and foremost to have courage. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Elijah, Daniel, Joseph, Mary, Peter, Paul, John, all of them were confronted with a task that at times scared them to death. And God said to each of them, "Have courage." And if you embark on a journey with God, particularly one involving change, it takes courage. If your experience is anything like mine, you might be told that what you're doing is impossible. You'll have the spectre of failure hanging over you. You may face opposition. You'll go through periods where all you want to do is pack up and do something safer. You'll be tempted to retreat to a place of safety, of normality, of caution. And in the face of this, God says to you, be courageous. Take heart. Be strong. Be courageous. In a book written by Winston Churchill called His Finest Hour, based upon his experience from 1940 to 1945, you may have seen the film The Darkest Hour. And I know that Churchill is something of a controversial figure, but in May 1940, he faced an overwhelming challenge of leadership, a situation in which he previously failed many times as a leader. He was put in a situation where his country was faced with a deep and severe crisis that threatened its very existence. And it was in those dark and difficult times when he realised the essential characteristic of his leadership was going to have to be courage. He was later to say these fabulous words that are quoted at the end of the film. Success is not final. Failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts. And alongside courage, in any disciple or leader, we must have perseverance. If you read anything about planting, one of the greatest reasons for a plant's failure happens because something called the S-curve. This describes what happens with startups, new plants, new businesses, new initiatives of any kind. The S-curve tells us that they nearly always start with a dip. Your output doesn't match your investment initially, and you virtually always see an initial dip. And those experts say that this initial dip can be up to 2 years. And this 2-year time is absolutely crucial. This 2-year time is where most businesses, where most plants and new ventures give up. In fact, it's reported that up to 8 out of 10, 80% of small businesses fail in their first 2 years. And the reported stats on new worship communities or plants aren't much different. So why do these plants fail? Those who study these things say it has something to do with bad origins, the wrong call, lack of discernment, unhealthy leadership. But they also say sometimes it comes down to perseverance. When everything you do doesn't seem to be working yet, when your hopes and your dreams are crumbling around you, when you would rather go and work at Tesco's, when you're at the bottom of the S-curve, are you going to hold on? Are you going to keep running? Are you going to finish the race? Those of you who were of TV watching age in 1968, the veterans amongst us, may well know of a guy called John Akwini. This guy was a Tanzanian, a marathon runner at the Mexico Olympics. In 1968, marathons were tough races, but this was raced at altitude and with searing heat, so it was really, really tough. But when this race was over, the stadium crowd began focusing on other events. Several hours later, as that day's activities were drawing to an end, suddenly this guy, John Akwini, entered the stadium tunnel and started his last lap, shuffling along, his face contorted in agony. Gradually, the crowd caught on and started cheering wildly. And when he finally crossed that finishing line, it was a deafening noise. At a later press conference, he was asked by someone, "You were so far behind, why didn't you just give up?" He replied with these fantastic words, "My country didn't send me here to start a race, but to finish it." I don't know about anyone else from that Mexico Olympics, but I do know about an obscure African who came last in a marathon. And I know him because he came to finish that race. In Hebrews 12, Paul speaks about finishing a race. And as he neared his life's end, this image of a race became more and more important to him. And this desire to finish the race became more and more urgent. Something that he was so bothered about that he mentioned it in Hebrews, in Acts, in 1 Corinthians, in 2 Timothy, and it was something that he felt he needed to pass on. And this is it. This thing that you're called to, he said, it looks like a race. You aren't just called to begin, you're called to keep running. You aren't just called to start, you're called to finish your race. And I never saw that marathon race in 1968. It was before my time. But I did see another race in 1992. In 1992, I flicked on the TV and I watched a live 400 metres race. And it was a race that many others will never forget. And it went something like this. I don't recall who won the gold medal in the 400 metres in Barcelona in 1992. Not many people would. But I do remember a guy who, together with his father, who was the other guy in the clip, a guy who knew that he was there to finish that race. And Derek Redmond did an interview after the race, and he said that as his dad came up to him in the final straight, his dad said to him, "You don't have to prove anything, Derek. You can stop now." And Derek Redmond turned to his dad and said, "Get me back in lane 5, Dad. I want to finish the race." My friends, as we end this evening, and as we end our few weeks together, I don't know how your race is going this evening. Some of you will be flying down the home straight. Some of you will feel like you're winning, but some of you have broken down. Some of you might be on the verge of leaving the race altogether. And if that's you, then I say to you, hold on. Hold on. Keep holding on in this journey that God has called you on. Keep holding on at the bottom of the S-curve. When you stepped out in faith and it appears just now that nothing is working and all your efforts have come to nothing. Right now, perseverance is an act of will and a gift of grace. One of the greatest qualities of Christian discipleship and leadership. I pray for you on whatever journey God has called you on, this journey of reaching the 99%. And when times are tough and your resources are at their lowest, for courage and perseverance to say to your Heavenly Father, "Father, get me back in lane 5. Dad, I want to finish the race."
We hope you've enjoyed this session as we've explored the question of how do we keep going? How do we persevere in these journeys of missional discipleship and planting that God has called us on?
And we hope you've enjoyed the whole course. As we said in the beginning, hopefully God has stirred in you a desire to engage with the 99% of people beyond the current communities of faith. And you're able to see how you could be involved in leading or joining a new worship community.
This is our last teaching week, but next week you'll be invited, as we mentioned earlier, into what we call Cultivate Conversations. One-to-one conversations with somebody talking through what God has been saying to you and what might be next in your journey. We're eager to hear about how this will unfold in your life, so please be in touch. We'd love to hear from you.
Our time is up. So as we end the Cultivate course, I would encourage you to start as we began, by praying for each other, for this gift of courage and perseverance in your life, in this season of your life, and on whatever journey God has in store for you. From all of us, goodbye.